I think like many other companies, I mean, I wouldn't say we're the only ones, but, having inclusive language, job descriptions, those type of things, I think have actually built awareness and make it more intentional of things that we need to be thinking about on it.
Especially in your case, 25 years of imbibing a particular culture, it actually becomes a part of you. And
Yeah.
the distinction between who you are at the workplace and who you are at home, I think that kind of ceases to exist.
Welcome to Culture Café, a vibrant and inspiring podcast series brought to you by the Confederation of Indian Industry and Avtar, celebrating 25 years of shaping inclusive workplaces. In this milestone year, we bring you transformative conversations with leaders who are redefining workplace cultures. From boardroom wins to human movements that changed everything. These conversations are your backstage pass to how organizations thrive one connection at a time. In this episode, our guest today is Allison Pineau-Good, steering both compliance and diversity initiatives at Arabelle Solutions.
A wonderful warm welcome to all of you to this episode of Culture Café. And I have the great pleasure and privilege of having Allison Pineau-Good, Chief Compliance Officer and Chief Diversity Officer at Arabelle Solutions. Allison and us go a long way back when she was with GE, a stellar career there for 25 years, a silver jubilee career. And then now she is with Arabelle and kindly agreed to join us for this podcast. A very warm welcome to you, Allison.
Thank you very much. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in, and I want to know, how does it feel to have worked for a group for a quarter century and then moving on to another organization, another set of rules, another culture? How does that feel, Allison?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you appreciate what the nodes that you've had, so what you've been used to doing different things. But then I think you also kind of see things in a different limelight. I mean, some of the
Mm,
things in terms of sponsors, I think, the sponsors that you've had that helped you with your career, you realize quickly those sponsors may not necessarily be there anymore. So it's really trying to find a way to navigate. I have to say, this is moving from an American culture to a French culture.
right.
I'm fortunate enough because I speak French and I've been living
Yeah.
in France for quite a lot. So it's been a good, I would say, way to kind of connect and learn about doing things a bit differently, and at the same time, being, I would say, patient with yourself, but patient with some of the changes that may be coming, because it's not always necessarily, always what you anticipate, but
Yes.
there's things that you learn along the way. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And yes, going from the American culture to French culture, which typically is, believed to be a little bit more laid back, a little bit more, calm. That's the impression that one gets when one, thinks of the French culture, the culture of workplaces in France. Now, we definitely need you to tell us whether that's the way it is at Arabelle. But the question that I have for you here is, are there any leadership behaviors that you observed at GE, with your leaders, which you have like subconsciously absorbed and which you find yourself kind of replicating here at Arabelle?
No, absolutely. It's a great question. And I mean, I think one of the key things, and it ties into my role in compliance, is the importance of speaking up. If you say something that doesn't seem just right and seems a bit unsettling, you speak up. It could be speaking up because you saw somebody not following the right process. It could be being an upstander. So in the middle of a meeting, you realize that there's a bit of, one person talking over somebody else, and then you say something. So I think it's important to have that mindset of being able to speak up. And recently I was in a session, at a personal basis with my own children. And I remember kind of questioning myself, should I have said something or not? And, I was reminded because my kids were like, well, look, if you are in that role and you wouldn't speak up, who would? And it's
Wow.
true, speaking up,
Yeah.
you realize that it's important not only in your work life, but it's also important in your daily life. And it's important to act in the same way that you would, even if somebody's, not necessarily watching. So it's important to continue that way.
Absolutely. And I think, especially in your case, 25 years of imbibing a particular culture, it
Mm,
actually becomes a part of you. And,
yeah.
the distinction between who you are at the workplace and who you are at home, I think that kind of ceases to exist. And
Yeah.
you're essentially the same person anyway. So those values which you hold dear and you cherish at home become your values that you exhibit in the workplace, and I guess vice versa holds good too. um
Absolutely. And it's good to
so
have a
yeah,
reminder from your children
yeah,
because sometimes you
yes,
you can forget.
absolutely.
So,
Oh my god,
yeah.
totally true, totally true. um and one of the things that children really help us do is not bother about the whole likability of things. That's
Hmm.
where children really hold us true to our commitments and our words. So
Oh,
speaking
yeah.
about likability, has there been a time when you as a leader have had to deliver some very unpopular news, or something that in terms of culture would be a bit rough? Has something like that happened, Listen?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think this happens, when you have restructuring, you have to deliver sometimes the news that's very unpopular. I think one of the things that can we also somewhat resonate right now, coming from my American background, is in 2020, I'd just been appointed the chief diversity, one of 10 very, I would say, very fortunate people within GE to be nominated. And we had this huge, I would say, energy and vibe because we're like, oh, we're the chief diversity officers. We want to do so much. And we had started the momentum in my organization because we started with unconscious bias training, and we were on a uptick of saying, oh, this is fantastic. We need to roll it out quickly. And then came an executive order from President Trump that said, no more training programs. All that momentum, all that enthusiasm that we had quickly became, uh-oh, what are we going to be able to do? And knowing that the vast majority of my organization is outside of the US, so not necessarily particularly, impacted
Exactly.
by that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd say that was very unsettling because we had a lot of momentum, a lot of people interested, then it was like, we got to put everything on pause because, there's this executive order and GE Aviation at the time was impacted. So, the way we went around it was looking for, what exactly is in the executive order? Can we continue with
Mm.
providing unconscious bias training in a way that allows for it? And we were able to make for that trend, but I have to say it was one where we had a lot of people very, I would say, unsettled, just trying to realize, well, why can't we continue on when in reality we're not based in the US, we're based in other
Mm.
countries. Why not we continue on? And I have that feeling, and I get a lot of that right now as questions is, well, what's happening now in the US? Is everything stopping when it comes to diversity programs and all that? And I said, well, I mean, as far as I've seen, no. They may not be calling it the same way, but I haven't necessarily seen all of a sudden a change. And I think,
Yeah.
4 years later, I think we're starting to have that feeling again. And I think, there's thankful people that are looking for different ways to navigate. And I'm very hopeful that that will continue on and that, we can continue the momentum that people been building over the last many years to progress.
Alison, hearing you speak with such an extent of authenticity, care, and concern was truly gladdening. I must say that, because this has been something all of us have been very concerned about. And I remember how absolutely passionate you were
Yeah.
about diversity. And I mean, in your own personal capacity, I remember the global research study, the DEI audit that we did for you, and that was
Yeah.
under your vision, and it was something you wanted, to be done so that every organization would know where they stand.
Mm.
And I can imagine how you would have felt to see whether, with so much of change, so much of VUCA-ness in this whole thing. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for articulating that. But when it comes to inclusion, and you spoke about non-conscious bias just now, do you really think technology can be a useful aid, a useful ally when it comes to enhancing inclusion in the workplace? Do you think that is something that's possible?
Yeah, and I mean it's a great one. I have to say, I've gone from a shift of a company that everything was in English to now everything being somewhat in French.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was a bit surprised with, but by us doing all employee calls and having live French translation,
Wow.
has had been well received by so many, which, quite honestly was something that somebody else could have done.
Yeah.
But it's a technology that I'd say having, online or having somebody doing translations or whatever, it's a way to be using technology because it's a lot of information to get. And, some
Mm,
of the context with my organization does is really very technical. And being able to open those accessibility barriers has been huge.
mm,
And I think like many other companies, I mean, I wouldn't say we're the only ones, but having a inclusive language, job descriptions, those type of things, I think have actually built awareness and make it more intentional of things that we need to be thinking about on it. And I could tell you, like, some of the things that I realize is in my new company, they have a way of, talking about handicap, disability, not necessarily. And you realize some of those terminologies by calling it out, saying, well, that's actually not very inclusive in terms of language. It's important. And it's important to say those type of things and call it out so that you make people aware and then they see it and, telling them it's, uh, better abled or something like that is a bit more inclusive than using language that could be detrimental and hurtful for some.
yeah. No, that way, I think, even though there is a great fear about AI and,
Mm,
what it's going to unleash upon the world, I definitely believe that, for purposes of making it a more inclusive world,
mm,
in a way that's not very protracted or very dragged out, AI really gives us solutions that are spontaneous, that are instant, and
yeah.
you have you're immediately being able to create inclusion at
Mm,
that minute. So I think, yeah, I also tend to agree with you that technology is a great leveler, it's a great builder of bridges, but I guess one has to also use it with care
yeah.
and caution. Yeah, especially when it comes to AI.
And
Um,
I
yeah,
mean, I could just say one thing is, one of the
yes.
softwares we use for human resources provided suggested skills. So I think it had to do with the fact when people were doing their annual evaluations or whatever, it would suggest some skills that people, I guess, they
Wow.
kind of picked up through it. And I
Wow.
think it's great because, indeed, if it picks up by somebody that they're enthusiastic, they have energy, or they have self-confidence, that's great. However, to your point, there's a bit of a constraint that needs to be handled when it comes to AI. And I say this because we had somebody that had been on long-term sick leave, and they were going into their portfolio because they hadn't been in the portal that often because they were on sick leave. Well, they looked into their suggested skills, and their suggested skills amounted to the fact that they had like diabetes. You're like, what? I mean, how could that be seen as a skill? And that's why I'd say there is a limitation when it comes to
Yeah.
artificial intelligence, because it's
Yes.
great that you suggest things, but it suggested items that, maybe the person was looking up diabetes or something like that. I don't know. But it does have its limitation, obviously, as well. So you need to definitely take it with care.
Yeah. No, great. Absolutely wonderful anecdote. Um, so, Alison, even before when you were with G and we would interact with you, the depth and breadth of your experience would always be so amazing and so inspiring. Two organizations, G Healthcare and G Power. Now, in these two, there are many similarities. Of course, the first being that they are both part of the GE group. But what was different about them, and what were the different skills that you picked up in both these different organizations?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. Indeed, there are two different organizations, but I think that's what I'll allude to at the end. Even though there was two different organizations, there was still the same company culture and feeling when it came from one company to another. For me, being in GE Healthcare was very stable. GE Healthcare had three main headquarters. Mainly it's the same people that had been working there for many years, and it was one of those, if you wanted to move on, somebody needed to leave because it was like there was only, you were playing musical chairs and there was only one seat, and you just waited. So it was a very predictable environment and very stable. And I remember my manager at that time that was saying, at one point, was saying, you know what? I think you have a lot to bring to others because I think you've done your time here. And I kind of was
Mm,
thinking, wow, is that a good thing he's saying or a bad thing? Basically telling me,
wow.
look, I think you have more to bring outside of healthcare than you do to bring it. And, now that I'm how many years out, I realized what he was saying is that indeed, I had a lot of energy, I had a lot of ambition, and it's something that I needed to bring to a new organization. I needed to kind of mix up a bit rather than keeping in the stable, known and, feeling uncomfortable
Yeah.
situation is what I needed. And he was right because, sometimes you decide to go to an organization, this organization, um, had just been acquired. It was the legacy Alstom, also the French influence because it was one where they were being brought in to an American culture, so I could kind of bridge the gap between being American but also living in France. And it's true that sometimes uncomfortable situations and not so, I would say, shiny or the best places, you realize you still have a lot to bring and you have a lot to learn. And I think that's what I realized is that there was many opportunities that opened their way for me leaving healthcare into a stable organization to moving into a G Power.
Mm,
There's no way I would have been the chief diversity officer for healthcare.
yeah.
Yet I had that opportunity. I still have that opportunity. And I think this is where you realize that sometimes allowing yourself to be feeling uncomfortable and going
Mm,
into a different organization, you have a lot more to bring than you may bring in the same place you've been for 18 years. So that's where I'd say. And then when I go into where I'm at now within EDF, EDF, I was expecting a very similar environment. I mean, EDF is not a conglomerate, but there's a lot of different subsidiaries of EDF. But I thought that culturally speaking, it'd be the same. Like whether you're in
okay.
this or that, you feel the same. The answer is no, they don't feel that way because they're kind of more linked to their subsidiary. There is the whole EDF group, yet the culture is not necessarily always the same in all of them because it depends on that affiliate, what kind of culture they want. And I think that's been kind of the biggest aha moment for me, realizing I was in an organization that whether you were in GE Healthcare, GE Aviation, wherever, you still
Yeah.
felt you were all part of a GE and you saw the meat bell and you're like, ah, that's my company. Mm.
I know. In fact, that actually leads me to my next question. Many rituals that we kind of, enjoy in organizations, and we kind of, truly associate that ritual with the culture of the company. Is there something that you miss or you think of even 10 years later from, your GE experience?
Yeah, so I think one of the rituals that I installed within in GE, and we practice it quite often, is we'd always start with a safety moment. And I remember, in 2020, Larry Culp had just arrived. And I was like, it's great that we always start with a safety moment, but maybe we can end with an inclusion moment so that people feel like included as they walk away, that they remember, like it's not just like safety, but it's also you start with safety, you end with something where people feel included. And we started sparking this off, and it was fantastic because you had people that, would bring in, life examples. I remember somebody was watching a movie, a Disney movie with their children. And in the beginning, there was a notice saying, look, this movie is from how many years ago? It may not necessarily be considered the most inclusive. We just want to give you a warning because at that time, it may not have been like it is today. And
Oh,
so the
lovely.
person took a picture of it and was like, oh, this is going to be
Ah,
on my inclusion moment because they're like, wow, I wouldn't have expected it. It could have been, like, I don't know, Lego did a series on everyone's welcome, or I forgot what the name of
Yeah.
it, but Lego did kind of a diversity thing, and
Yeah.
I talked about it and I thought, okay, this is fantastic. Well, somebody then bought it for their children. Their children were so excited to build it. So, it's just really, kind of taking away a bit of some sort of inclusion that you can think of. And it doesn't have to be something you have to research. It could be something that you discover in, over the weekend, or you hear about whatnot. And I think that's really one of the footprints that I want to keep in GE, was the fact that you start with safety and you end on inclusion.
With
And I
inclusion.
think it was a great way forward.
My next question is the final one for this podcast. And again, in some wonderful way, you have enabled a beautiful segue into this last question.
Mm.
Um, whenever we think of inclusion, whenever we think of respect, whenever we think of culture actually being a very strong, robust one, psychological safety is not far behind. And when you spoke about, starting with safety and ending with inclusion, I was quite amazed, because that literally is the definition of psychological safety. You talk about safety, but what you're really looking at is how included do people feel, how confident, brave, how clear am I about speaking my mind. So how did this kind of happen, and how did you make that happen?
Yeah, I think to your point, psychological safety is really been, but one of the elements of really making sure that people, feel themselves when they come to work, and comfortable
Yeah.
enough to speak up. And indeed, what I've seen, and I've really tried to install within my organization,
Mhm.
from a compliance perspective, we track the number of anonymous cases we have. Typically,
Okay.
anonymous means people don't feel comfortable enough to put their name to it, because there may be a fear of retaliation, a fear of being named, you name it. And, a lot of times, this was one, when I look at kind of the average industry average, about maybe 30% are people that don't necessarily come, put their name forward.
Yeah.
We're at 5%. So I have at
Wow.
5% that people are not coming for
Mhm.
whatever reason, and it may be for
Yeah.
a valid
Yeah.
reason. Of course, that's their prerogative. But I think, people feeling comfortable to put their hand up, to speak
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
contact me. This is why I say to everybody, I would rather somebody pick up the phone and ask me a question
Mm.
than realize after the fact maybe what they've done is not the right way, and that it could have, consequences for them. I'd rather them speak up. And I remember when I took this role, at the time it was a CEO that was a salesperson, not a legacy GE person, salesperson, that said, you know what, Allison, most people wake up in their morning not saying, today I want to do something wrong. People wake
Yeah.
up and they want to do
Yeah.
their work or whatever.
Yes.
And why do they do things wrong? It's maybe because there's pressure. Maybe they want a new car and they need more money, or maybe, there's pressure, like, to succeed, or to, it could be whatever. And he said, look, you should assume good intent. And he's right. Even if I know somebody
Absolutely.
may have done and
Yeah.
misstepped,
Yeah.
by just letting them know, look, I want to hear you out. There may be a reason, why you did this, is important. I've been in situations where somebody did make the wrong call, wrong move. And I just tell them, I said, look, we're in a situation right now that we need to move forward.
Yeah.
It's going to be much easier for you to share what happened, even if it's not comfortable. Maybe it's a wrong decision. But at this point, it's better to move forward than, to not necessarily share it. And I've had these situations. I've had 2 or 3 people this year alone where I said, look, I know you did something that you shouldn't have done. You probably regret it. But at this point, I'd say it's much easier for you just to tell me what happened so we can move on, um, because it's going to actually bode better for you in the end
Yeah.
than if we're all kind of running around circles and whatnot. And I think, giving people that option to reflect and realize, okay, if everybody makes mistakes, some make worse mistakes than other. clearly this mistakes are that I'm talking about have nothing to do that it impairs anybody's, home safety. But it's
Yes,
important to build that atmosphere where people feel comfortable enough to speak up and share with you what they did. And I'm able to get people to do that, and I want to
yeah,
continue with that because I think that's how we move forward, by allowing people to have that space to feel comfortable enough,
yeah,
and say the things that they don't want to necessarily share. Doesn't mean everyone's doing that. By no
yeah,
means would
true,
I think that, but I think it's important to focus on that. Giving people the space to feel safe is very
absolutely.
important,
Yeah.
and that's it.
Yeah, Alison, I'm so grateful that we got you on this podcast because Avatar is completing 25 years this year.
Wow!
This is our Silver
Congratulations.
Jubilee year. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alison. And hearing your description, your depiction of culture, and truly, what psychological safety should stand for, and just every little aspect that comes together to create the cohesiveness which a truly strong culture manifests at every level. I mean, this was just so wonderful. Thank you so much, and
Thank you
here's
for having me.
wishing you, Alison, absolutely the best, at Arabelle and ahead. And here's wishing that you have a fabulous stint in India as well. And
Yeah.
I really hope we get to host you at the Avatar office sometime in India.
Anytime.
So,
I would
thank you
love that.
so much. Thank you,
Thank you for
Alison.
having me. I really
Yes,
appreciate it.
and folks, as you would see from my visage and the way I'm so excited, I think this was such a fantastic podcast with Allison Pineau-Good, Chief Compliance Officer and Chief Diversity Officer at Arabelle, just sharing from her heart, which is how characteristically she does, about everything culture. So look forward to more such amazing conversations. And here's me signing off on this episode of Culture Cafe, brought to you by the Confederation of Indian Industry and Avatar, powering workplace cultures for 25 years. Thank you, Alison.